by me in this thing, and normally I would just kind of ignore it, but I feel like this kind of comparison is unavoidable, especially given this episode. So let's just go ahead and get this out there right off the bat. A lot of people have covered Star Trek and Voyager and all the other shows I plan on doing before I have. I am not exactly the first nor the 20th person to do so. Several comparisons are going to be made to me and other different shows. Will Wheaton did a thing once upon a time. Sci-Fi Debris did a thing. There's an entire website that does things just about Voyager. I don't want to name check everything because then I'll lose customers. But seriously, though, the point I want to make here is that, yes, it's going to sound like I'm repeating some of the things these people say, and I want to make this absolutely clear. There is no intention to do so. While I do certainly take in their opinions and read what they have to say and view what they have to say and whatnot, the idea is always just to see someone else's perspective on it. The same reason I encourage you guys to give your perspective, because I always read your little comments when you say something about what you think about this or that. Even if I don't actually respond to it, I do actually read it, and I find that interesting. So that's just the first point I wanted to make right off the bat. Now, I had this whole speech here for this next little segment I wanted to talk about before we actually get to the episode proper. And I realized as I was going through it that I was simultaneously right and wrong. So I'm just going to give you the right part of it. A lot of people have talked about the death of Star Trek. Obviously, the literal death of Star Trek was a movie called Star Trek Nemesis, which quite literally was the bullet that killed Star Trek. I mean, it's hard to define that any more clearly than that. But prior to Nemesis, a lot of people have pointed to this episode or this episode or this era, usually in Voyager, sometimes in Enterprise, as the point at which Star Trek started the nosedive, right? Not just in terms of quality, but in terms of health as a franchise. I've mentioned before that Alliances back in Season 2 is widely considered to be pretty much the moment that started. It is often considered by several people who actually worked on Star Trek that the big moment where that started was an episode called Equinox, which we're not at yet. However, regardless of whenever the death of Star Trek started, it is my opinion that just prior to this episode, basically immediately part of the previous episode when I really started thinking about it, but this episode emphasizes my point more clearly, was not the death of Star Trek, but this is rather when Star Trek entered its new era. There's a lot of eras in Star Trek, and they're defined differently based on the individual, of course. I usually think of, there's original series and first movie. There's second movie up to fourth movie. Fourth movie up to season 3, season... I guess that would be fourth movie up to season 3, and then sixth movie up to this episode, actually. Which is, now that biggest gap I just mentioned there, it's basically season 3 of TNG, which also included Star Trek 6, and the beginning of Deep Space Nine, all that good stuff, is what I usually refer to as the golden era of Star Trek, when it was really pretty much riding high, all things considered. There was some bad, certainly, and Lord knows Deep Space Nine had a really rough start. But overall, it was doing very well. It was the first time Star Trek actually had 2 shows going at once. Shortly thereafter, they would again have 2 shows going at once when Voyager launched while Deep Space Nine was still going, Then this episode came along, or, again, more accurately, the episode previous to this one. The reason I delineate this as the point at which Star Trek changes is because it was a difference in mentality and tone, theme and style. Spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about continuity. But don't worry, I'm not going to bang on it like I usually do. Seriously, I'm kind of going somewhere else with this than I normally do. Continuity is more than just the number of torpedoes you used, or where this location is, or how fast a ship can go. That stuff is nice, and I like it when that stuff is contiguous. But continuity, it's the strongest feature of continuity is, say it with me now, character growth. When from episode to episode the characters involved change, grow, learn, develop, die, new characters join. Now Voyager does do this to some extent, and there's a later episode, I believe it's this season, which will actually highlight this point even better, and I'll talk about it when we get there. But the thing is, throughout TNG, from especially Season 3 to Season 7, throughout even the early things of Deep Space Nine, there was always a strong emphasis on that character growth continuity. The characters actually changed. Events that affected the character would affect them and their development, and you could actually feel the characters growing throughout the series, right? After this, with a few exceptions, that basically stopped in Voyager. Now, Deep Space Nine obviously kept going with that until Deep Space Nine ended, right before Equinox, by the way. But from this point on, if you pay attention, the only times at which there is genuine character growth in the series, in the franchise, not counting Deep Space Nine, is the exception. Nowhere can I point to this more strongly than Harry Kim, the least characterized character in all of Voyager, who spontaneously wakes up one day and says, "Hey, I have a character now." You probably think I'm joking, but if you remember I don't remember the specific episode, but it's literally an episode where Harry is acting oddly for the first chunk of the episode. And most of the people who watched it at the time were like, "Oh my god, he's an alien or something," you know? And when he finally starts talking to Tom about it, he literally says something along the lines of, I woke up one day and I realized I hadn't done anything with myself, my career, and I needed to move forward. And so from that point on, they give Harry more stuff to do as a character. But that's exactly my point. That was his character growth. Someone flipped a switch off camera. Now, I'm not going to say whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, believe it or not. Because this change in focus was something that actually did help Voyager to really come into its own, ironically. What Voyager ended up doing as a result of this is, rather than trying to be Star Trek The Next Generation .5, which is what most of Season 1 and 2 were, they tried to reach for their own feel, their own attempt, their own push for things, and usually what that meant was very individual episodes. Very little story continuity, virtually no string continuity whatsoever, very little character continuity. Focus on this episode, make this episode good. And it is worth noting, that's a valid approach. There's really nothing wrong with doing that. And obviously that was what the writers at this point in time were doing a better job of, because overall, even though there's some greats prior to now, overall most people agree Season 3 and 4 of Voyager is when Voyager really got good. And it also, by the way, that mentality in a nutshell explains what went wrong with the Borg later on, if you really think about it, for those of you who've actually seen this show before. But this episode is really the first time when that attitude was fully on display, I think. The idea here was, let's just focus on this episode. Now, within this episode, we learned some things about Tuvok, we learned some things about Janeway, we learned, it's a good episode. In fact, I really like this episode. But as far as the rest of the series, it might as well have never existed. And that's ignoring the points at which it actually contradicts canon, which are several. Which I'm not even going to get into that. I might as well just be nitpicking at that point. Star Trek's been contradicting canon within itself for forever. So I'm not even going to get into that. I also want to give, I've got a note here, a genuine amount of praise for both Kate Mulgrew and Tim Russ, because both of them put in really good performances in this episode. Now, you may be wondering why I've been on this whole thing. This all started because this episode was actually part of the 30th anniversary of Star Trek. I was originally going to smash this episode. Honestly, I was. Or at least that was the intent. I had kind of prepped in my mind how I was going to talk about it. And while the point I started with is still valid, because the behind-the-scenes material hasn't changed, having rewatched the episode, I actually really liked this episode. It's among my favorites. I was almost surprised. But that's the whole point I made earlier. This new focus on ignoring contiguousness, ignoring character growth, just focus on this episode and ignore the rest of the series, ignore the series, that's right. Ignore the rest of the series, actually seemed to work pretty better for them. The reason I was so pissed off is this is the 30th anniversary of Star Trek. Now, one of the reasons I call this the golden era is, for all intents and purposes, Star Trek was doing really well at this point in time. First Contact was being hyped to hell and back. That's Star Trek 8, if you're not familiar with it. And everyone was super excited about it. It was coming out in about 2 months after this episode aired, give or take. I looked up the exact dates, but it was about 2 months. Deep Space Nine was going well, and was just about to do their big episode, Trials and Tribulations, and they'd already started a lot of the Dominion work. So Deep Space Nine was going great. Most of the cast of Next Generation were using their fandom and their success with Next Generation to start off their own respective careers. LeVar Burton really started getting into the Screenwriters Guild and the Directors Guild and all that fun stuff. A lot of good stuff happening in this era for Star Trek, and because of Star Trek. 30th anniversary, what I'm trying to get across here, was kind of a big deal. So when Deep Space Nine, and I hate to do this, but I have to make this comparison because Deep Space Nine's the other show that did something with this anniversary, because those are the two shows running. Deep Space Nine, when they got the news that they were doing a 30th anniversary episode, they were like, "Oh yes," and they sat down and they hammered and they worked. They would, blah 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 blah. Voyager, when they got it, well, they already had an episode that was actually supposed to be happen during season 2, which they'd already done some work in filming for, which was going to be about this memory virus thing, which we're not even going to talk about for the most part. And they was like, well, let's adapt that. Let's use the memories he's using to go back to Star Trek 6. Here's the difference in approach between these two things. One's a job, and one's work. Now, for those of you who have not watched me talk extensively, and I've talked about this in several things, but I'm just going to lay this out here really simply. These two are mutually exclusive. A job can never be work and vice versa, because work is something you do that you love. Money is not necessarily part of the equation. You can get paid for work. I get paid for work. I know several people who have work that they love doing, and they do have it as part of their daily routine, their career, if you will. But work is, by definition, something you really put your heart into. Job is something that, at absolute best, is something you tolerate. More likely, it is something you don't like doing or don't want to do, and it is without question something that, if not for the paycheck, you wouldn't be doing. A job is something you put up with in order to continue existing. Now, you can see the very obvious difference in mentality between these two. I'm not going to go into the full philosophical ramifications of these two mentalities. What I want to point out here is that Deep Space Nine looked at trials and tribulations, or rather, looked at the 30th anniversary, and that was work to them. They really poured themselves into it because they loved what they were doing, and they really wanted to make a great episode, and poured their hearts and souls into it. Which is why, even though Trials and Tribulations has a lot of issues with it, and is kind of wonky about the timeline, and the graphics are a little dated, even though they're literally brand new, amazing at the time. It's still a great episode. Flashback was a job for these people, for most of the people involved, most of the creative staff involved. However, again, this is where I was going to slam this episode. But again, and this episode and later episodes show this, I feel like maybe the job focused helped them to really put forth a better product on an individual level, even though it was at the expense of the long term. And I do mean that sincerely. Let's make this absolutely clear. I'm not going to say that's a good thing or a bad thing, because that's not my point to judge. I can only give my opinion on it. It is my opinion it was a bad thing because of what I just said. It was the short term at the expense of the long term. It was the same thing I get angry at corporations a billion times a day for doing. For trying to make money now at the expense of the later. And that's kind of what they were doing. So they did make some good episodes now. Season 3 and Season 4, I'm really excited for. I'm really looking forward to seeing a lot of these episodes. I'm so jazzed about. I mean this sincerely. I'm actually happy about finally reaching Season 3 of Voyager. But at the same time, there's no denying the fact that Star Trek, pretty much from around this time, and without question from Equinox on, was doing this in terms of overall quality. And I think that mentality is why. But anyways, one more thing. I just want to talk about this. I know what you're going to point out. You're going to bring up 7 of 9. 7 of 9's introduction, application, and initial usage was phenomenal. And I'll talk about that more when she joins the show. But pay attention to how many episodes they did about 7 of 9 basically doing the same song and dance, never actually changing, never actually growing, never actually adapting, because that would be more appropriate, based on the events of the previous episodes she's been in. Now, she did some great stuff, and the actress is amazing, no question there, and there are some great 7 of 9 episodes, but how many times did she learn a lesson about being human? How many times did she learn how she was wrong in her approach? How many times did she learn to understand how to interact with others on a better level? Because it kept happening because of this mentality that I've been talking about this whole time. One episode. So while that episode may work, as we saw more and more of these episodes, because she was such a fascinating character and popular character to write for, seeing the same plot line expressed over and over like that, it got old. And it specifically got old for people like me because we've done this before. You should be growing. You should be changing. For God's sakes, Riker grew the beard in only a year. What is taking you so long? Moving on. I only have a few notes on this episode because It's a good episode. But my very first note here is Neelix is a bad cook. Isn't that funny? However, believe it or not, I feel like I'm trying to be contradictory with this episode, but I'm not. It's just that, when I first saw the scene where Neelix is being mocked for his bad cooking, my first reaction, and I mean this literally, was to groan rather loudly out loud. I'm watching the episode here, hear headphones on, I'm just like, ugh. Really? Because even I'm getting tired of pointing out how tired I am of them making this Neelix is a bad cook joke. But then they actually put a tiny little spin on it. Tuvok tries the drink and actually likes it. And then he starts making the meal, and even though Neelix is being irritated, and that's comedy, it was still interesting in the fact that he was being presented as maybe improving, maybe being better, maybe he and Tuvok were actually having some kind of, actual growth going on. No, don't worry. They'll have growth in one episode later on in this season, by the way, and then it'll never be mentioned again. I also want to point out one thing. I'm not going to comment on the ridiculously bad science in this episode. Even for Star Trek's sakes, this is actually pretty bad when it comes to their application of science. A combustible gas comes to mind, or a virus that it hides itself as a memory engram and doesn't replicate or reproduce and only leaves its host when its host dies. Yeah, not even going into that. That can go away. I want to give some praise for a scene, too, that at the same time I kind of hate. For those of you who are not aware, Uhura, Nichelle Nichols, was actually going to... I can pronounce her real name better. Nichelle Nichols was going to have a guest spot in this episode. And in her own words, it was insulting. It was literally just a nod, for all intents and purposes, a cameo. And whether you agree with that statement or not, and I'm not going to say if I do or not, it's hard to deny that, again, with that whole job mentality, most of the approaches to the past were exactly that. Here, show up for an episode, and then go away. And Nichelle Nichols was having none of that. And I'm not debasing her for her decision. It's her decision, and she certainly will go to that. But they had this scene where he's doing something called... I wrote it down, but I don't know how to pronounce it. Cathira? Something like that? It's a little Vulcan Lincoln log kind of a thing. The reason I have praise for this scene, though, is the fact that it's a small little bit of world building. It's all about... the whole thing is something about... The Vulcans use this in order to construct this, and it's indicative of their state of mind. It takes great balance, coordination, perception, that kind of a thing, in order to correctly and accurately build the thing. Now, that only sounds like something that is very Vulcan to me, but that sounds like a cool little bit of just flavor, fleshing out the Vulcan as a people and the franchise as a whole. So I'm with that. It's probably no surprise that we basically have Tim Russ to thank for every moment that is like that in this episode, which is my segue. Some people may or may not be aware of this, but as I mentioned before, by this point in time, most of the actors on Voyager had enough of a pull to have a degree of creative control over their characters, which at the time was still actually pretty unusual for a character to have that kind of creative control who wasn't, well established for all intents and purposes. But Tim Russ actually went back to the screenwriters, to the script editors, and said, this is wrong. This is not what my character would do. I'm only going to give you one example, but because Tim Russ actually lists several, but the one example that really stuck out for me was apparently he had an affair with a non-Vulcan prior to meeting T'Pel or whatever. I suddenly can't think of her name. His actual wife, which he's with, up to the modern era. And he felt like that was completely out of character for him, even when he was younger. He also felt like it was very un-Vulcan for him because there was a huge thing about why he left Starfleet and why he was back into Starfleet and all that stuff. And he actually went back and said no. And so at several points in the episode, Tim Russ actually took them to task for all intents and purposes on the script, and it was edited. And the net result is really good. Go figure, an actor who actually understands their character and is a good actor does a good job of performing well when they have that sense of creative control. I mean, this is nothing new, but I do have to give him praise for that very definitely. Now, this is another thing that is simultaneously frustrating and awesome. This episode is so weird. I took note. It is 15 minutes and 27 seconds until the Excelsior shows up. 15 minutes and 27 seconds. For those of you aware, obviously I watch DVDs, so I have no commercials or anything like that. For those of you who are not aware, that is a little over a third into the episode. And all of that was just establishment of Tuvok's memory engram problem, and that's basically it. Not all of that, and I mention that because all of that is basically padding. It's all just the episode that they'd already filmed, basically. All the stuff that they'd already done for the memory engram virus storyline, which is now grafted onto the good storyline. The reason I say that that's both frustrating and good is the good part is it was an amazing reveal. I admit I was really lucky because I didn't know anything about what they were doing for the anniversary. I didn't know about George Takei coming back. I didn't know about Whitney coming back. I didn't know about, I wrote his name down, Jeremy Roberts coming back. I had no idea they were going to do this Excelsior thing for this episode. Now, granted, it was an episode called Flashback, but given all the flashbacks he kept having to the girl on the cliff, that wasn't necessarily indicative for me. So I had no idea what I was walking into, and suddenly, and the way they do it is very well directed. Some good directing in this episode, too. All of the sudden, it's like Janeway's on a ship that's being exploded, and you catch images of people in the old Star Trek movie uniform, and all of a sudden, Sulu says, "Damage report," and he comes onto the screen, and then it cuts to black, and then we have a commercial break. That was actually really well done, and the reveal of that moment was awesome. It's a shame that it was spoiled for basically everyone else that I've ever talked to, because if that wasn't spoiled for you, then that moment would be a great reveal. Shrug. I just mentioned the directing. We're going to segue into that. The directing in this episode is actually really top-notch. They had a really good job of using the flashback as an actual narrative tool rather than a crutch or a hindrance to the actual storytelling. For example, on many occasions, literally, Tuvok will go in the middle of a sentence to another scene, and the way they edit it and the way they present it, it's very natural. It flows very smoothly. And many times he'll actually say things that will segue into the next scene, and on top of that, this is great. On top of that, he will bounce back and forth between talking to Janeway and then talking in the past. In other words, if you're paying attention, informing Janeway of what's going on, and then the memory of what happened in the past, because that's basically the difference here. And he does it so smoothly, and all the other actors around him basically merge seamlessly in the scenes. It basically was really well done. I just really wanted to praise that, because it's really excellent directing, very good job on the actors, and again, praise to Tim Russ. Speaking of praise, I can finally get to this point. Like I said, it's really great that they got through. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed an actor. They also got Michael. I can't read my own handwriting. Michael back. He's the guy who plays Kang. He also played Kang on Deep Space Nine. It was really cool that they actually got him back to do this role as well. I thought that was a really nice touch, and also kind of explained why he and Sulu had a bit of banter. Fun scene, by the way. And I'd also like to say that I have literally nothing but praise for George Takei and our good woman Whitney's performance, because both of them really do an astonishing job in this episode. Whitney obviously was very happy to get back in uniform and be back on the screen, and from all intents and reports, behind the scenes, she was having an absolute ball with this episode, and you can tell that enjoyment just comes through in her character and in her performance. And Takei apparently really loved getting back to being Sulu, and performing in the captain's chair again and all that fun stuff. It's actually kind of a shame, but I'll talk about that very last. I'm saving that for last. I just wanted to praise him, most especially his speech. Now, I mentioned... Oh, wait, I never actually did that. I was going to mention, when I was going to do a rumination on the Star Trek movies about Star Trek VI, that Sulu in the captain's chair was something that just absolutely fit. It made perfect sense. In hindsight, it's one of the things that none of us guessed happening, but when it actually happened, we were like, yeah, okay, that's perfect. And George Takei did a great job of portraying Captain Sulu, arguably better than he portrayed Lieutenant Commander, whatever he was, Sulu. Excuse me. But he has a really great speech here when he's in the captain's chair about how more happens on the bridge of a starship than rules and regulations, about how this is about family, that kind of a thing. It's actually kind of ironic, because that very thing, as I've mentioned, is A, one of the greatest strengths of Star Trek as a whole, B, arguably the only reason Voyager got a shot, because the cast and crew actually did a really good job of interacting with each other and behaved similar to a family, and C, ultimately ironic, because that very mentality from a writing perspective was thrown out the window so that they could focus on the individual moment. Nevertheless, very good speech by Sulu there. Loved that, loved that. I also want to say they did a great job of recreating Star Trek VI on the small screen. Obviously, there are differences between the two. I didn't even have to watch it side by side. I have a good audio and visual memory to check that immediately. Obviously, this episode is a bit of, in several cases, it does not work as well as Star Trek 6 with regards to the scenes and the ones they're imitating and mimicking, but they did a good job of what they did. Because anytime you want to recreate a scene from a movie years later on a TV, that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. So the fact that they did as well as they did is something I definitely have to praise. Very, very much props there. One of the other things I found myself liking more than I actually thought I would is the way that they integrated Janeway integrating with the past. By which I mean, obviously, since this whole thing is from the framing device of a mind meld, it made sense that Janeway was basically invisible and irrelevant, and most of the actors did a good job of that. When Janeway then started actually interacting with the past, and it was a nice shift, is what I'm trying to say. I mentioned before how, Tuvok would go from Janeway past talking to, Janeway present talking to past memory. At this point, the two blurred to the point where Tuvok talking to Janeway would be happening in real time, while stuff was actually happening in the memory, but Tuvok also still had the ability to move through his memories. So it was actually kind of cool the way they presented it, and that's just all I wanted to mention there. Now, 3 last thoughts. First thing I'm going to do is what I'd change. And the first thing I'd change is really obvious. Take the virus plot, make another episode entirely out of it. I don't even think you really need to get rid of the virus plot, like eject it. It wasn't necessarily a bad plot, it was unnecessary here. The fact that they actually had to adapt this plot is all I really have to say on that. Get rid of that. Make this be all about... I mean, oh God, there's so many. I just thought of like 5 different things you could do right off the top of my head. There's so many ways you could have Tuvok be reminiscing or be mind melding, or they need some information from the past, or maybe there was some kind of thing that happened there that was significant, or maybe even started off where there is no mind meld. That first 15 minutes I mentioned, maybe for those first 15 minutes, no mind meld. Tuvok is just remembering the past of his own accord, and then something happens and he decides to share it with someone else, probably Janeway. There are so many ways you could do that. That's pretty much the only change I'd make to the episode. George Takei, Whitney, Roberts, Michael, everyone actually did a really good job as far as the guest stars. I also really have to give a lot of props to the props department. The set designers really, really outshone themselves in this episode. They actually went back and really, really worked with the base material, not just watching the movies in order to get information from that, but actually looking at the diagrams and set information that they still had from when they filmed Star Trek 6, and rebuilt the bridge of the Excelsior and several of the crew areas of the Excelsior very well. They did a phenomenal job, and I have nothing but praise for them. They really, really did a good job, and they deserve every ounce of credit they get. Now, 2 more things I'm going to talk about with regard to this episode. Forgive me for the kind of long episode. This is the 30th anniversary, so, forgive me. I actually was going to write it down word for word, but I don't really need to. There's a quote in this episode that is almost universally reviled by Star Trek fans. Myself included. I'm not going to exclude myself here, but I have something else to share about it other than the thing. See, here's the thing. Originally, I sat down and decided that, it's one thing to say something is good. I've championed this for years. It's one thing to say Chrono Trigger is good, but I don't want to do that. I want to say why Chrono Trigger is good. I could look at, All the Bravest and say that's bad, but I don't want to. I want to actually explain why it's bad. I want to actually give reasons. So I was going to sit down and I started writing out reasons why this quote was terrible, stupid, awful, and just generally ridiculous. But as I was analyzing it, it really started to get me thinking about the one good thing that came out of the quote. And that's what I've decided to share with you, rather than the 7, I've got them written down right here, reasons why that quote is stupid, ridiculous, just bad. Let's talk about one good thing that came out of it. For those of you not familiar with it, there's a scene in this episode where she's talking with Harry. And there's actually 2 good things, excuse me. I was going to mention the good thing even before this whole change. And she's talking with Harry, and she basically mentions how she is very... I should have wrote it down word for word. She basically says something along the lines of, the whole lot of them would have been booted out of Starfleet in today's era, but some days, I wish... She basically, let's just put it bluntly, she casts judgment upon the previous eras of Star Trek, of the old era, of the original series and the original movies. Dumb line. Not going to argue that. 7 reasons why it's bad. Not going to argue that. Let's talk about the 2 good things that came out of this line. Number 1, Kate Mulgrew. Now, Kate Mulgrew, I've said before that what happens with regards to a performance is dependent on so many factors that it's hard to limit it down. But many times you'll see 2 big things happen. A good actor is destroyed by bad directing, bad writing, or both, or a bad line a bad line is salvaged by either a good director and or a good actor, whatever. Kate Mulgrew's tone as she says that line, as she casts condemnation on those people, as she judges them, as she says they would be good out of Starfleet, the way she's so talking about it, the line itself on the paper is incredibly condescending. But the way she presents it, it's clear there's not only a sense of wistfulness, but almost an envy to her tone, and a great deal of nostalgia for it as well. And given the whole anniversary thing and the very tone of this episode in general, that's pretty much exactly what it should be. So definite props to Mulgrew and or the director for that. But here's the other good thing that came out of that. This might be long. Forgive me. Catherine Janeway is not a captain. Now, your reaction to that is probably going to say something about you and what you think about Star Trek, but Catherine Janeway is not a captain. For centuries in real life, the captain has been the apex of any navy. The one point at which everything really tilts, the fulcrum for all intents and purposes, not the apex, excuse me. The cornerstone, I would even go ahead and call it that, which I guess is kind of fulcrum. Whatever. Point being, you have to be able to look down to the individual level and be able to interact with people, be personable, be careful, be capable of functioning in so many different levels on your ship, and at the same time, you also have to have the higher level view that the Admiralty does and be capable of understanding that there are things beyond your own ship. The captain position is what makes a navy work. I don't think anybody would actually argue with me against this point. Especially the 3 people I know personally who've been in the Navy. The United States Navy, of course. Now, the reason I bring this up, though, I've said it before and I've said it again. Janeway, as she's presented, even in the episode, no headcanon here, no creative reinterpretation. As she's presented within the episodes and throughout the franchise, she is never actually designed to be a captain. She is designed to be behind a desk. She is Admiral material. And I mean that sincerely. I kind of mean that as an insult. It would actually, but the kind of a science officer kind of a thing. I've said this before, too. She is more of a science officer than she is a leader. And that's fine, really. There's a reason I kept talking about how awesome it would be if she had originally been the first officer, or even, the second officer of the ship, and had to take command, and had to exert some kind of, character growth in order to withstand the greater charisma and experience of the actual commanding officer, who ended up being on her ship, that'd be Chakotay. But, whatever. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that this episode and that line really helps emphasize that point. Why Janeway is not a captain, because she doesn't understand what being a captain really means, except when she does, because as we all know, she's a little schizophrenic in her portrayal throughout Voyager. But the point is, for the most part, 90% of the time, actually, I'm even going to say like 99% of the time, she does not understand what it means to be a captain. Because the time she breaks the rules, she doesn't really do it right. And usually she doesn't really do it for the right reasons, too. Oh, we have to take these Ferengi down. Why? Because screw 'em! I believe was generally her perspective there. She doesn't understand what it's like to be in that chair, to be that fulcrum point, to understand all the pressure and to deal with it properly. She belongs to be kicked upstairs. It's probably the only reason that seeing her as the person who's an admiral and arguably in charge of all of Starfleet, but whatever, in Nemesis didn't bother me so much because she belongs in the Admiralty. As soon as she got home, they probably kicked her upstairs so hard and so fast. She probably leapt on that promotion, which says something too, doesn't it? Now, obviously this is the realm of speculation, but the fact that she did take that Admiralty position says something. Because most captains would rather chew their own arms off than lose that captain's chair. Kirk himself kicked himself for years for making that decision, and he was constantly trying to undo it. Picard refused at every point in time, and historically never lost the captain's chair, you know? And partially at the advice of Kirk, I might add. You know, Sulu is another good example of this. You get my point. Janeway was the kind of person who obviously belonged in a situation where she could be that condescending, she could be that judgmental, she could cast her judgment down on the lesser individuals, the lesser captains, because she didn't actually understand how life works. And forgive me for being blunt, but that is pretty much the job description of being desk-bound. Last point I'm going to make, the Excelsior show that we never got, and at this point, never will. For those of you who are not aware, prior to this point in time, for about a year, I believe, there was a lot of public support going for a third Star Trek show to start up, Star Trek Excelsior. I was one of those supporters. I wrote the letters, mailed them in. I was part of that. And George Takei himself was really pushing for that. He really wanted this Excelsior show. And several of the other people behind Star Trek were also pushing for it. All told, it's actually a little surprising we didn't get an Excelsior show, because there was so much support on it from every point in the entirety of the production, from the individuals, from the crew, the staff, the former people, the other people who've been in other Star Treks. A lot of political push for it. The only people who didn't want to do it were the Paramount executives. Which probably by itself explains why we never got an Excelsior show. The reason I wanted to bring this up, though, is not to mention that, because that's just a historical curiosity at this point. I want to ask you a theoretical. Would it have been a good thing? Here's the thing we don't know. We don't know who would have been in charge of it. We do know that certain people who were in charge of Star Trek as a whole, such as frickin' Rick Berman, would have had some degree of creative consultation and control over Excelsior. There's no denying that would be a bad thing. Whether or not Rick Berman ever did any good for Star Trek, that's very debatable, and I will agree that I personally think he did do some good stuff. By this point in time, I think he was the freaking antithesis of Star Trek and should have just jumped off a cliff and saved us all some trouble. So, forgive my ire, but an Excelsior show which at the very least had some, had him at its head, I'm not sure how well that would have actually succeeded, because imagine if they tried to do stuff with that Excelsior show. Imagine how much headbutting would have gone on behind the scenes. Imagine how disappointed we would have been if, instead of Enterprise, a show basically nobody wanted, but then started to get good, but then got canceled. You remember how disappointed several of us were when that happened. Imagine how bad it would have been if that had happened to Excelsior. Think about Season 1 Enterprise and how garbage it is. How absolutely disgustingly pathetic that season is. Think about that for Excelsior. Think about all that terribleness being there with George Takei and Whitney and everyone else. And then Season 2, and then they start to get good, but then they're canceled because Nemesis was the bullet that killed Star Trek, as I mentioned earlier. Imagine how much worse it would have been if that happened. Now, all of this is, of course, pure speculation. We have no idea what could have happened. All I'm saying is, as much as I was pushing for Excelsior at the time, with a greater understanding of what was going on behind the scenes, in hindsight, I'm actually a little glad we didn't get Excelsior, because it's very, very likely it would have tanked, and not for the good reasons, and that would have sucked. And now I'm finally done talking. Holy crap. Do you believe this is the 5th video I've recorded today? My goodness. See you next time, guys. I should start doing this for these. See you next time, guys.